Before I begin the sermon, I want to introduce someone to you. Later in the sermon, there's going to be a very short film clip. And when this person comes up on the screen, some of you may feel like, well, this is not like any Pastor Looks I've ever known. Her name is Nadia Bolz-Weber. She was a comedian, professional comedian, and addict who, through some strange turns and twists, ended up in seminary. After seminary, she formed the Church for All Saints and Sinners in Colorado and has nurtured that church and pastored it. Interesting people who would be uncomfortable in many of our more traditional religious settings. But oh my, she certainly has a way of seeing Scripture and getting at the heart of it. So I just want to set that up for you when we get to that a little later on. This text makes me squirm because it uses all of the images of the church militant, even as it tries to transform those with words like peace and ambassador. The church oftentimes, in its reactivity historically, has found itself in such reactive places that it chose to use the instruments of violence and confronted that which it feared the most. Or the powers that be have found a way to exploit the church's fear or the church's greed throughout history to make the church into a sometimes group of warmongers. There's no nice way to say that, depending on what period of history you have. So I was raised in a church that could bend that way at certain times. And I had wonderful teachers, Sunday school, training union, people who tolerated me in all kinds of ways. But always there was that faith as an adversarial tool. There was a narrative running through it all. And sometimes there were those who lovingly introduced violence as a way to build up our character. One, Charlie Gibson comes to mind, a brick mason, a good man, who was one of two coordinators with the RAs. RAs, that means Royal Ambassadors, the Baptist version of Boy Scouts. As a Royal Ambassador, I will do my best to become a well-informed, responsible follower of Christ. And I probably, if you give me enough time, could remember the rest of the pledge. So it kind of stuck with me. But Charlie also believed that his mission is not only to make disciples, but to build us up in the manly arts. Somehow he thought that was a part of the Christian narrative. And so when members of the WMU, the Women's Missionary Union, were absent around the building, and we had an RA meeting, he would whip out the ropes on occasion, and he would box off this little area just outside the choir room. I thought that was appropriate. That's why Jan's laughing. Making us a makeshift boxing room outside the choir room. Wasn't as big as a ring, but it was there. And the same characters kind of went in and out, and some were pretty pathetic. I would have been one of those that was pretty pathetic. The gloves were heavy, so to go 3 rounds, it took all you could do to just hold your hands up for 3 rounds. Junior man. He was the Fonzie among us. Leather jacket, greased back hair, ducktail, no motorcycle. But he was the one who considered himself cool, the one who intimidated everybody. Now, there was a neighbor down the road who, when he showed up, would go into the ring with Junior But otherwise, nobody wanted to go into the ring with Junior. One night, I don't know how this happened. I can't remember. But somehow Charlie conned me, since the neighbor down the road didn't show up, into going into the ring with Junior. And there were like gasps. Because everybody knew while I might be the bigger person, I was going to get killed. As they're putting these monster gloves on, and I'm looking across the room, I can barely hear everybody laughing and wondering what my face would look like when it was all over. I was just standing there panting, thinking, please, God, please, let me die of a heart attack. They laced those gloves up. And Charlie was just behind me, and he kept whispering in my ear over and over again, remember, son, put on the whole armor of God. Put on the whole armor of God. And he said that over and over again, and I'm thinking, well, bring it to me, for God's sake. I'm going to need that breastplate, and I'm going to need a big helmet. Somehow, he was sure this was going to inspire my faith. So, someone found an old collection plate and a pen where they took up, the records on Sunday morning, and they would ding that collection plate, which was our version of the bell. And when I heard that pen ping off that collection plate, my knees almost collapsed. And I walked forward, absolutely certain that my end had come. Have you ever found yourself, maybe not in a ring, but in some circumstance where you literally were frightened to death over what might happen in that situation? You felt so alone and isolated and overwhelmed that you saw no solution in sight. The writer of this letter to the church in Ephesus, who uses Paul's name, and I'm not going to get into that debate because forever people have been debating whether Paul wrote it or not, and I just don't care. But the writer of this piece is trying to address a church who may be feeling somewhat like I was feeling in that ring that night. The adversaries were incredible for those who were trying to stay in the way of Christ, trying to be faithful when there were those lined up against them who seemed to be an overwhelming force. Sometimes, by the way, some of those folk were religious people, and most often it was the whole weight of the Roman occupation force, whose hand and presence was there in all times and places and in everyone's life and business. Here were people who had listened to the word passed along, the words that came supposedly from Jesus about how we should live, what relationship was back, about who God was, and what that meant in terms of how we lived, what that meant in terms of the integrity with which they should live. And yet they knew that it could cost them, and it could cost them dearly. It never occurred to me that with those huge, huge gloves, that no matter how badly bruised that Junior could, the bruising he could impose upon my body, my end was probably not at hand. But my anxiety and my fear was registered on the same meter, perhaps, that some of those folk that this writer was trying to speak to about who they were and whose they were and what their role was in the world. The powers that be are always in our stuff. The powers that be are structures and systems that we as human beings help to create. They are at times governmental structures. They are sometimes corporate structures. They are systems of power. And we oftentimes forget, because we develop these narratives about governments and systems, we forget that we have created the systems, and we don't always do so well at being faithful because we are somewhat frail and prone to the human condition. So sometimes the best of us goes into the systems and the worst of us, which is why sometimes those systems work well for people and sometimes they're devastating for others worldwide. I don't care what label you use. And there are people within those systems who will exploit our fears to their benefit. They will tell us, for instance, that anyone who has different diets and different customs and who uses a different name for God, all of those people are out to get us. We should fear them. They will tell us that some group of people, because they happen to have a different racial makeup, they're the people we need to keep our eyes on because they're out to get our stuff. They will tell us all kinds of things to play on the fear. I'm trying to say to you, that's how domination systems work. Always playing on people's fears. And what do? We sometimes act like I did, cowering in the corner of that ring, knees buckling, knowing that we're going to be pummeled by something we don't even understand. The writer of the Ephesians is trying to say, get yourselves ready because there is adversity in the world and there are adversaries who would do you harm. And so prepare yourselves so that you are clear about with whom you are standing. He talks about, again, defensive equipment, but then addresses himself as an ambassador. And at one point it talks about the instrument as a way of peace. And so we have to listen to these scriptures not in tune with hearing, well, get ready to fight. But we need to hear these scriptures that the game's on, be prepared, and don't be afraid because you're not alone. Nadia Bose-Weber did a whole series of little YouTube segments, and I picked one out, and the subject she's talking about is specific to one issue. And if you go off on that issue, you're going to, which is an important issue, and not hear the larger scope of things, you may miss the point I'm trying to get to. But listen carefully as she talks about, in the context of the apocalypse, where she talks about what it means to face domination systems. Coleman, can you cue us up there?
As a clergy person, I'd like to welcome you all to the apocalypse. Pull up a chair and make yourself uncomfortable. If when you think of an apocalypse, you picture a scary, doom-filled punishment from above, you're not alone. Originally, though, apocalyptic literature existed not to scare the bejesus out of children so that they would be good boys and girls, but to proclaim a big, hope-filled idea that dominant powers are not ultimate powers. Empires fall, tyrants fade, systems die, God's still around. In Greek, the word apocalypse means to uncover, to peel away, to show what's underneath. That's what this country has been experiencing in recent months. There's not been a sudden uptick in sexual misconduct and assault in our country. The Me Too and Time's Up movements are simply exposing what was already there. The male domination at the center of the sexual harassment issue is being revealed apocalyptically and in prime time. Wokeness and policy change are a start, but not enough to dig out the full infection. This is why I welcome our moment of uncovering. We need to see how deep the heresy of domination runs, and then remind one another that dominant powers are not ultimate powers. So if those who came before looked to the Bible to justify their dominance, then let us look to it to justify our dignity. It's in there. Theology and liturgy are just too potent to be left to those who would use them, even unwittingly, to justify and protect their own dominance. And sometimes the origin of the harm really can be the most powerful source of healing.
I wanted you to hear that the dominant system is not ultimate. The letter to Ephesians is not apocalyptic literature. For that, you need to go to Revelations and some of the texts we run into during the Advent season. But it's the same spirit. The writer's saying, you may be frightened, but you are not alone. You may be challenged, but you have the right stuff. Because the one who is the ultimate power, behind and in all things, is with you. You are not alone. So when you find your voice and speak truth in love, and when you push back on those who would feed your fear, stand tall and with courage and with a sense of peace, know that God is with you. And you don't have to be afraid. When we get to the social hall, I know you're going to ask, regardless of what the sermon said. So yes, I did go into the ring. And I did adopt, this won't mean anything to most of you, but this was one of my dad's favorite boxers of all time. I adopted the Floyd Patterson movement, the Pickaboo. And Junior worked on my midsection with credible fierceness. But I was fat. And as I stood there covering my face, I was grateful at that moment, for the first time in my life, I was fat. And it dawned on me while he was working on my fat that I could swing my arms pretty easily around and up under. And I did. And the first time I landed on his nose, he staggered. And I don't know who was more shocked, Junior or me. And for 3 rounds, he pounded my fat. And I took those swings, and he looked a lot worse than I did when it was over. It's sad amongst boys that you only get great respect from being able to inflict the most violence. But nobody invited me into the ring after that, even Junior. Thanks be to God. It wasn't God who got me through that moment. It was sheer luck. But in the matters that moment for and the moments that matter for you, it will be God who will get you through and will stand in those hard places. So be at peace and live in love as God reigns in your world.